So we are in chapter 4, and the big thrust of this chapter has been to teach us the principle that the Torah is something absolutely unique. And the reason we're discussing this is because we've spoken about the nature of the neshama, the nature of the soul, and we've identified that the soul has these 10 soul powers, and we've identified that the soul has 3 garments: machshava, dibur, and maaseh, thought, speech, and action. And initially, when you first encounter that, you think, okay, so the thought, speech, and action, we call them garments, and at the end of the day, the nature of garments is that they are somewhat disposable, which means to say that after you've finished wearing whatever it is that you're wearing, you take it off and you're still you. So even if you had to throw out your very favorite outfit, you would still be you. That's the nature of garments. And so the minute we say that we're talking about garments of the soul, you think, okay, so it's obviously not a really important part of the soul. But what we've started to discover is, hang on a second, that might be technically accurate, but it's not absolutely true. Because with these garments, with this capacity for thought, for speech, and for action, with that, we actually have the opportunity to connect to God in such a profound way that even the soul, when it was in heaven, could not do that. How? Because of Torah. Because we discovered that the Torah is not just a wonderful work of all kinds of philosophy and theology and law and history and moral guidance, but the Torah is God in book form. So as long as the soul is floating up in heaven, it doesn't really get to experience the Torah in the way that the Torah was intended. That doesn't mean to say that souls in heaven do not study Torah. In fact, that's apparently what they do all day. I mean, I haven't really checked it out, but that's what we're told, that in heaven, souls study Torah all day. But their experience of Torah study is vastly different from ours. In fact, we learned last week that God's greatness is his ability to, and this is why we compare Torah to water, to take the highest of the high and compress it down and make it available in the lowest of the low, which means that when you open up a Torah scroll and you look inside and you see the words formed with ink on parchment, every one of those words contains God's essence. Now, you don't get that in heaven because you don't get Torah on parchment in heaven. So you get the ideas in heaven, and you probably understand those ideas in a far more profound way than you do here on earth. But you don't get access directly to God's essence when you study Torah in heaven in the same way as you do here on earth. So that's really surprising for us, and it's incredibly insightful. And that's why this chapter is such a powerful chapter, because it's effectively going to tell us, and this is part of the next upcoming piece, it's going to tell us why living in this world is actually a really good thing. Now, I don't know how many spiritual disciplines out there sell that story, that living in this world is a really good thing for you spiritually. Very few people would say that. Most people tell you, get out of that world as quickly as you can. And until you get out of that world, stay away from whatever the world has to offer, because it is all sin and it's all distraction. Well, we have got a little bit of a different attitude in Judaism, and we're going to speak about that attitude in the course of this evening's piece of Tanya. So let's dive right in. And where we are at the moment, just if you have a look on the screen, so you'll see that it must be 7 lines, I think, down. The last word on the line, the word is ume'achar. So let me see if I can actually highlight it over here. There you go, that's where we are. The highlighted word, ume'achar. Ume'achar shahatorah u'mitzvoseh. Because Hashem, in his incredible kindness, chose to devise a system, both of Torah, which is, of course, the intellect, and mitzvahs, which are the instructions for our behavior. In both of these, God chose to compress himself into our accessible experience. Therefore, as a result, HaTorah mitzvahseha malbishim kol eser bechinois hanefesh. Now, the first thing that happens, you see, ask the average person, what happens to you if you learn Torah? What happens to you if you do a mitzvah? The average person will tell you, what happens? I become more religious. I become more observant. I become more spiritual. Now, spiritual is a bad word, by the way. The more you learn Tanya, the more you come to appreciate that spiritual is a very generic word, and it really doesn't capture what it is that we're after. Because there are many spiritual things, and not all of them are necessarily positive. So the objective of Torah and mitzvahs is not to become more religious. It's not to become more spiritual. It's not even to guarantee that you have a better place in the next world. You know, everybody's investing in real estate in the next world. So here's where you get some really good coastal properties. Learn Torah, do mitzvahs, and you're going straight to the Golden Mile. It doesn't work that way. So what's the first thing that occurs when you study Torah or you do mitzvahs? And we are going to distinguish between two different spiritual technologies over here. But generically we say, Malbishim kol eser bechinois hanefesh. Malbishim comes from the word levush. Levush is a garment. And we started off this chapter speaking about garments. And when we spoke about garments, initially we kind of poo-pooed them and said, garments, what are they? They're what you wear for other people's benefit so that they know how to relate to you. They see your uniform, they know your rank. They see if you've dressed formally, they should take you seriously in a business meeting. You wear your garments because of the elements, because it's cold outside, so you have to wear something warm, or it's raining, you have to protect yourself. And then we learned that actually there's a lot more to garments than just that. Malbishi means to encompass something. When you put on a garment, it encompasses you to a certain extent. It's designed to fit your body, so it encompasses your body. When a person learns Torah or does a mitzvah, through that activity, there is a holy garment that encompasses that person. It's almost like you're being held inside a very protective, holy cocoon. Now, I don't mean that in the sense of that you now have some kind of special protection and you can run across the street without looking. Instead, it means that there's some kind of a holy aura that begins to envelop a person because you've learned Torah and because you've done mitzvahs. But not an aura in the sense that, you know, some people are like that and they consider themselves quite spiritual and they look at you and they read your aura or they claim to read your aura or whatever the particular case might be. I'm not talking about that. It means there's a real energy of holiness that in a real way envelops you, and it's all 10 facets of your soul that become embraced by this holiness. Now let's think for a moment. Most human experiences are quite limited. What happens? Most human experiences, some affect my brain, I become intellectually enriched. Some affect my heart, I feel good. I feel inspired, I feel uplifted. How many things are there in our lives that we could claim affect the entire structure of our soul? Because remember, we learned in the previous chapter that the soul is made of 10 koichos, 10 soul powers. How many things could you imagine in life that completely embrace and encompass the entire structure of your very soul? I don't know if anybody could think of anything actually. Because generally our life's experiences are quite compartmentalized. So this did something for me, and that did something else for me. When a person learns Torah or does mitzvahs, it has this embrace over the entire essence of the person's being, the 10 powers of your soul. You are now living in that reality. Prior to learning the Torah, your soul was trapped in this world, and the soul is struggling to get out because it really doesn't want to be in this world. It's not interested, as much as we might be interested in things like, I don't know, the Super Bowl or what we're going to have for dinner. The neshama is not interested in those things, so the neshama wants to get out. Here, something occurs that shifts that energy. The neshama is now held in a healthy, wholesome, meaningful, holy space because I learned Torah and did mitzvahs. And not only that, v'chol taryag evoreha meroisha vi'ad ragla. The impact of learning Torah. So in other words, right now we're studying some Torah together. You could think, okay, it's nice, like I've allocated 45 minutes out of my week that I'm going to learn a little bit of Jewish mysticism because everybody wants to be a shtickle mystic. So I'm also doing my mysticism for the week. You don't realize what's happening right now. As we sit here in this moment, right now, absolute, infinite, divine God Himself is enveloping us right now, from top to toe. The 613, as He calls them, limbs or organs of the soul. So the human body is actually designed to reflect the design of the human soul, or the neshama. And that's why they work so well together, because They're kind of mirror images. Now, the body, we know, of course, is made up of various organs and various limbs and various components. Each one of those components is designed to reflect a similar spiritual component of the soul. So we're taught that there are 348 limbs or organs and 365 sinews or veins. And corresponding to that, there are 248 positive mitzvahs and 365 negative mitzvahs, because the goal is that every single stream of divine energy that comes through a particular mitzvah corresponds to a particular part of who we are. And it inspires and it uplifts a particular part of who we are. So when I do a mitzvah, the whole of me is completely enveloped in that infinite holiness. This is a radically different perspective on Torah and mitzvahs to what we're normally told. Because we're normally told that Torah and mitzvahs is a matter of dedication, service, religious observance. Now we're learning there's something else over here. There's something so large and so profound that the truth is we haven't begun to understand what exactly it means. And so we'll start to unpack it in the course of this particular chapter. First, we'll say this. Hare kula tzrura bitzroir hachayim es Hashem mamash. The first thing that happens to us when we study Torah, so we're going to focus primarily, even though you did say Torah and mitzvahs, but for the purposes of our conversation in this chapter and in the next chapter, chapter 5, we're actually going to focus most of our attention on Torah study. And that's why we started off over here talking about Torah and about how Torah is divine wisdom and about how Torah is like water, etc. So what happens when a person studies Torah? Hare kula tzrura, you are completely bound bitzror hachayim, in the bond of life, es Hashem mamash, literally with God. Now we don't use words for poetic impact. When you use a word like bound, what does bound mean? What comes to mind? Of course, there could be a negative connotation, a person who's a captive and they're bound. But the implication of bound is it's a secure connection. It's a connection that's not going to undo very easily. And the objective of our lives is to become bound with the source of all life. Tzrura bitzroir hachayim. We want to become completely bound in the bond of life. In fact, we even say this after a person passes away. One of our wishes, and we engrave it in abbreviated form on the tombstone, is Tehei nafshoi tzrura bitzroir hachayim. May this person's soul now be bound up in the bond of true life. Maybe their physical life has ended, but the bond of true soul life certainly can continue, and in some cases perhaps even begins only at that point in time. So because it's a phrase that we're used to in the context of people passing away, it's quite refreshing for us to know that you don't have to wait for a soul to be liberated from the body in order to have this unique connection to Hashem and to be completely bound up in the bond of life. Here in this world, I open a book right now as we are doing, and I study Torah. At this moment, I'm completely bound with God. Oh, there's an exception, by the way. If I'm checking my WhatsApps in the middle of the shir, well, maybe I'm not completely bound. Maybe there's one arm that wasn't tied in because it was too busy typing on the phone. But if I'm in this space, if I'm in the zone, I'm really doing what I should because I'm learning Torah with investment and with focused attention, then I'm tzrura bitzror hachayim es Hashem mamish. I'm literally bound up with God in the most amazing way. And we'll see in the next chapter, he unpacks this further, just how amazing the union between us and God will be when we learn Torah, which, by the way, is a summary of what the objective of Torah is. The objective of learning Torah is to create an opportunity for us to be completely bound with God. That's the purpose of studying Torah. There are side benefits, like you might get a nice position in the next world, or you might become a smart person, or even, if you're lucky, get a job as a rabbi. But that's not the point, the purpose, that's not the point. The point of studying Torah is Tzrura b'tzror hachayim. This is our access where we get linked in with a high-speed cable connection directly to God Himself. Now that's essentially how it works with Torah study, because Torah study is very personal. You can't just open a book and mumble the words and say, I have studied Torah. That's not how it works. You actually have to think. You have to sometimes ask questions. You have to sometimes pause and reflect and review. It takes a fair amount of personal investment, which is why Torah study becomes quite personal to the individual. Mitzvahs, not as much. I'll explain to you what I mean. If you had 5 people sitting in the same class, studying the same information, you can be absolutely assured that not one of them will walk out with an identical experience. That's the nature of the mind, it's the nature of the human being, it's the nature of study. Study is very personalized. That's why you'll get 2 people who'll walk out of the same lecture and have 2 totally different takeaways. Because that's the way we are. But when it comes to doing a mitzvah, if you had to take 5,000 people and line them all up in a row and tell all of them, I'd like you to take a coin and drop it into a charity box, which of course is the mitzvah of tzedakah, you would get 5,000 identical experiences. Now, that has nothing to do with how the person feels. Some person might feel, oh my gosh, why only a coin? Let me add some more. Another person might feel, whoa, what a waste of time to stand in line with 5,000 people just to put a coin in the box. Another person might say, wow, this is fantastic. Somebody's giving me free money to be able to do a mitzvah. That doesn't change the mitzvah. That might be their personal experience of the mitzvah. But the mitzvah itself will be identical 5,000 times over. It will be a coin going from a human hand into a charity box. So it's not as personalized. Torah study, the only way I fulfill Torah study is by understanding. And because no 2 of us understand identically, so by definition, no 2 of us experience Torah study in the same way. Mitzvahs are somewhat more inclusive, somewhat more generalized. Therefore, when it comes to mitzvahs, the expression we use is Ve'or Hashem mamesh makifa meiroisha ve'ad raglo. That when a person engages in Torah study, which of course is a mitzvah, and for that matter, when a person does any mitzvah, the person is completely enveloped literally in divine energy, in divine light. Now, the words over here are very significant because there's a difference between saying that something is meluvash, which means it is dressed in a garment, or saying that something is mukaf, which means surrounded. So let's do a little exercise together. If a person had to go to a tailor and say, do me a favor, I'd like you to make me a bespoke suit. So what's the tailor supposed to do? Take your measurements. That's the first step. And based on your measurements, design a suit that's going to fit comfortably. If the tailor doesn't really know what they're doing, you come back 2 weeks later for your fitting, and there's this large tent that completely swallows you up. You would not say, I am meluvash. You would not say that I'm now clothed inside this oversized XXL jacket. You'd say, I am swimming. I'm overwhelmed. Or you might say, I am mukaf. The material surrounds me. It doesn't sit well on me. Or you could have a whole lot of people who's sitting in the same room. And once they're all sitting in the same room, they're all mukaf. They're all surrounded by the same walls, the same ceiling, and the same floor. Now, each one of those people is an individual, but their experience of being inside the room, the fact that they are encompassed by the 6 sides of the room, is identical. So when you talk about Torah, we talk about meluvash. It's tailor-made. Each person dresses their mind in the content of the Torah uniquely. When it comes to mitzvahs, we say mukaf. We are all surrounded by the same divine light because we have done this particular mitzvah, regardless of our previous spiritual background, our level of understanding, or for that matter, our level of interest at the particular moment. So that's valuable for us to know, and based on that, the Alter Rebbe will now reference a few verses in the Torah that bear this out. So, Kamosha Kasuv, as the verse says, Tsuri echseboy. God is my stronghold. The most direct translation of Tsuri would be my rock. So God is my stronghold. I will take shelter with him. What's shelter? Makif, something that surrounds you, something that gives the sense of protection, something that gives a sense that you are within an environment that is designed to help you. So that's what happens when you do a mitzvah. You become encompassed by something of spiritual meaning, by something of divine value. It's greater than you are, and so it surrounds you. Or, uksiv, and the other verse says, Katsino rotzin tatrenu. It's a verse in Tehillim, same principle, that King David talks about this idea that Hashem's will encompasses me to protect me. The same principle. It's like I have a shield of divine will, which is the shield created by the mitzvahs that I do. And those two concepts effectively reflect what we're talking about here. You do a mitzvah, you're surrounded by divine energy. You study Torah, you're enclosed in divine energy. These verses describe Hashem's will and Hashem's wisdom, which are all expressed through Torah and the mitzvahs included within the Torah. Now, at this point, this topic may still be a little abstract to us because we kind of get it, that there's this sense of a divine aura that envelops us when we do what Hashem wants. But we need to unpack it further and understand it better. And in order to do that, we're going to start by quoting a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, which is very strange and difficult to understand in the 4th chapter of Pirkei Avos. That's why our sages taught, Yafa sha'a achas b'tshuva u'maisim tovim ba'olam hazeh. It is preferable, it is more beautiful, if you want a very literal translation, more beautiful to have one period of time, sha'ah is an hour, so to have one period of time of teshuvah and good deeds in this world, mikol chayei ha'olam haba, that is more beautiful than the entire world to come. This is the moment where your brain screeches on brakes. Whoa, hang on a second, what are you talking about? How is it possible that anything in this world could be equal, forget about more valuable, how could it be equal in valuable to anything in the next world? The next world is a place of spirituality. It doesn't have the confines of our experience. It doesn't have our limitations. Let's put it into language we can all relate to. It's better to have 1 hour of teshuvah and good deeds in this world. Let's think about good deeds for a moment. Have you ever in your life had the experience of doing a good deed that left you feeling it wasn't exactly as I would have liked it to have been? I wish I could have done more. I wish I could have started earlier. I wish I could have done it better, right? That's the human condition. So even when we achieve well, very often we still second guess ourselves and say, maybe I should have done it that way. Maybe I should have included this person. Maybe I should have thought of that particular thing. How do you think it is in Olam Haba, in the next world? Right, the next world. What's the big, there must be some very significant differences between our world and the next world. So what's the big difference between our world and the next world? Well, one of the differences is you don't have these problems of, I didn't really put my heart into it. There's no such thing. There are no limitations. So how is it possible that I could do a mitzvah in this world and it has greater value, not just than a moment in the next world, but the entire life of the next world? Does that make any sense? Let's put it differently. For many, many people, the only reason that you do mitzvahs is to get an access card into the next world. Now, logic says if something is the investment and something else is the return on the investment, you assume that the return is more valuable than the investment. Am I right? I'm not a business person. Does that sound right? Yes? Nobody goes into an investment saying, I'm going to pay $1 million, but don't worry, I'm getting a return of another 100,000. What are you talking about? The return is always the primary aspiration. So now, why do people do mitzvahs? Because they need to get through the door of the next world. You get to the next world and they say, did you ever read that Mishnah in chapter 4 of Pirkei Avos? Those mitzvahs are more valuable than this whole world. It's so confusing. So what are we gearing ourselves towards? What is our objective? Where are we supposed to get to? How can you say such a radical statement that a single moment or period of time of teshuvah and good deeds in this world is better than everything else in the next world? Doesn't seem to make any sense at all. Now, before we go any further, there are a few words that need a better translation than what we've already done. So let's go back and reread the phrase. Yafa, it is better or more beautiful. Sha'a achas, 1 hour. Now, why would it be 1 hour? 1 hour of teshuvah and good deeds? Since when are good deeds measured in hours? Is this community service that we signed up for community service? And if you want to get into Gan Eden, you have to prove that you did at least 613,000 hours of community service, and then they let you in. Since when are good deeds measured in hours? Why is that the way to refer to it? Okay, teshuva. We know what teshuva is. Teshuva is very much, let's be honest. What's teshuva? When you messed up, you fix up. So that's better than the next world. Maybe I could make sense of that, because in the next world it's a bit too late to do teshuva. So if you want to you want to repair the past, now is the time to do good. Okay, so there is an advantage to this world over the next. What are ma'asim tovim? What are these good deeds that people speak of? What qualifies as a good deed? Is a good deed the fact that perhaps you buy coffee for a friend? Is a good deed that you volunteer at an animal shelter? Is a good deed that you help an old person cross the road? Or is a good deed, and this is very popular today in the 21st century, when you're kind to yourself? So what is a good deed? Ma'asim tovim. And since when are Jews into good deeds? Good deeds can be very subjective. We're into mitzvahs. Mitzvahs means what Hashem decided is worth doing. So this whole phrase does seem a little strange. Let's unpack it. The very first time that you will ever encounter the word sha'ah in the Torah, it does not mean hour. The very first time that you encounter the word sha'ah in the Torah is in that very dramatic Cain and Abel encounter. What happens? Cain has an idea. Why don't we bring offerings to God? And Abel says, that's a great idea. I think we should do that. So off Cain goes and he finds the cheapest stuff that he can find in his field, and he puts it together and he says, okay, God, I've got a great idea. Here's a gift. And Abel goes and he chooses the best of his flock, and that's what he dedicates to Hashem. And the Torah tells us, God turned his attention towards Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering, he did not turn. In Hebrew, Vayisha Hashem el hevel ve'el minchasoi. Vayisha means, and God turned. Ve'el kayin ve'el minchasoi, Cain and his offering, loy sha'ah. He did not turn. Why is a passage of time called sha'ah? Because of exactly that, because the clock turns, because things turn over from one incident to the next, from one event to the next, from one chapter to the next. But the real meaning of the word sha'ah is to turn. Yafa sha'a achas. First thing that we have to recognize is that in this world you have the opportunity to turn. Gan Eden is a wonderful place, and I'm sure that it's filled with nice people. But you can't do anything dramatic. You can't turn your life around at that point. Whatever you arrive with, whatever you've packed, that's what you wear. So whatever you arrive in Gan Eden with, that's what you have. Those are your resources. That's your toolkit. And using that toolkit, you can keep moving forward at a particular rate of growth. But you can't turn anything around. So the first thing we have to know is Yafa sha'a achas. One moment's opportunity to turn something negative around in this world outweighs everything that you could possibly achieve in the next world. What is the objective in this world? Yafa sha'a achas. One experience in this world. It's an experience of teshuva. Okay, so we get that. Teshuva is turning your life around. It is the principle of sha'ah, of making the pivot. But ma'asim tovim is something way more profound than what people give credit. Everybody thinks, oh, ma'asim tovim, good deeds. Yeah, let's all be nice people. That's actually not what it means. Again, where's the first time in the Torah that the word tov, good, is ever used? Vayar Elokim es ha'oir ki tov. God saw the light that it was good. Because of that, consistently throughout the Torah, the word tov is often used to represent light. When Moses was born, it says, Vatere oisoi ki toivhu. His mother saw that he was good. And immediately the Talmud says, what do you mean he saw he was good? Every mother thinks her baby's good. What do you think? If you would have interviewed Moshe's mother when he was born, what do you think she would have said? She would have said, this is going to be the future leader of the Jewish people. Of course, like any good Jewish mother. So she saw that her son was good. What's the big chap of that? Says the Talmud, what she was expressing is that the house was filled with light. Because we know that the word toiv equates with light. So there are two kinds of actions that a person can do when you do mitzvahs. You could do mitzvahs because you do mitzvahs, because that's how you were brought up, because it's what you've learned how to do, it's become a habit. And we go through our mitzvah experiences somewhat robotically. Or you could do ma'asim tovim, where the mitzvah is done with focus and with passion and with intention, so that it shines, so that it is meaningful. If a person lives in this world and engages with Torah and mitzvahs in a meaningful way, and in a way that allows them radical change, so I'm no longer the same person I was because I've allowed the Torah to envelop me, because that's the theme over here, that the Torah envelops me, and the Torah defines who I am in a completely different way. So if I can go that way and have that experience, that is better than the entire world to come, and we'll explain how. Because the other problem we have is we have absolutely no understanding of what the world to come means. People have some strange ideas, I know. The cartoonists all think that the world to come is where people hang around on clouds playing harps. Some people think that the world to come is a spiritual version of being in Mauritius on the beach. Yeah, and they got some kind of, spiritual beachside service, drinks on the house. Some people think that the experience of being in heaven in the world to come is an experience where all of the things that you were unable to enjoy in life are now presented to you in a spiritual way. So like if you kept the Torah and you avoided all those pleasures, don't worry, God's got a storehouse of spiritual equivalents that you get in the next world. And maybe that's getting a little closer to what it's all about, because one thing we do know is that Olam Haba, the next world, and in this particular conversation we're talking specifically about Gan Eden, heaven, is a place of extreme pleasure. We have a problem understanding that, because to us extreme pleasure sounds hedonistic. Because all of the pleasures that this world has to offer us are by and large quite materialistic. There are exceptions. For example, the pleasure of music is more spiritual. The pleasure of intellectual appreciation for a deep and difficult concept is more spiritual. But we do have a problem, because when we think about pleasure, we typically think that pleasure is a physical and even hedonistic experience. So when they tell us that the world to come is an experience of pleasure, we don't really understand what they mean. Today we'll get a sense of what that is. So let's read. Just at the full stop. It's for that reason that our sages taught that it's better to have one experience of doing teshuvah and good deeds in this world rather than the entire lifespan in the next world. Why? So the typical approach of Chabad Hasidus is when you ask a question, you don't just simply answer the question. You analyze all the components of the question and redefine them, so then you realize, okay, I didn't even have the question in the first place. The reason we have this question is because we don't really have an inkling into what the life of the world to come is supposed to be. So how can you even be surprised that a part of this world is better than the whole of the next world if you don't even know what you're talking about? So let's start with the definition. Ki olam habahu, the definition of the world to come, otherwise known as Gan Eden, is that it's a reality shenenin miziv hashchina. It's an experience where your pleasure is the radiation or the radiance of the divine presence. Now we have no idea what that means. No idea at all. The radiance of the divine presence. If you had to say that to a friend of yours, you actually go to coffee tomorrow with somebody and you say, I was learning this thing, it's amazing. You know, if you do a mitzvah, it's greater than the radiance of the divine presence. They're going to check what's in your coffee. What exactly are we talking about? What is it? So he explains, Shehu Tainug Hahasaga. It's the pleasure of understanding. Think about this in human terms. Imagine that there's somebody who you care about who tells you, just wait. In 1 month from now, you are going to be so happy. And you start churning, like, what's happening? Can you give me a clue? Can you tell me something about it? And they're tight-lipped, they don't want to, but they keep telling you, in 3 weeks' time, you're going to be so happy. In 2 weeks' time. So what's bothersome about that experience? Why we become so curious and why we find it so difficult to hang on and wait is because we have a very intense need to understand what's going on. So then when the day arrives and they unveil whatever particular surprise it is, it's so exciting. It feels so good because now I know. Because now it makes sense. I get why you couldn't tell me. And I get why you were so looking forward to it. And I so appreciate what's happening. So the hasaga, the ability to grasp what's going on, gives an immense pleasure to the human being. Here's another example. Let's say that there's somebody you know who's behaved in a particular way that you find to be unusual. You don't know what's wrong with them. And you're too afraid to say anything to them. But you can see they're behaving in a way that it's putting strain on your relationship because they're not responsive, they're not available, whatever the case is. And then after a certain period of time, they come over to you and they say, listen, I just want to apologize if you felt that over the last period of time I wasn't so available, I wasn't so responsive. This is what was going on. And you're like, I get it. And you feel good. You feel good now that there was a reason, an acceptable reason why they behaved. It wasn't about you. It wasn't that they had issues. There's a certain pleasure in knowing. For which reason, the Talmud tells us that there's no greater joy than resolving doubt. Because the human condition is such that when we don't know, it gets under our skin. And when we have the aha moment, it's exhilarating. Now, the life that we live, we don't know much more than we know. Not everybody's willing to accept that or to admit that. But that's the reality. We don't know much more than what we know. So, for example, why did God design the world in this particular way? Why does there have to be so much suffering? Why is it so difficult to earn a living? Why is it easier for me to eat pancakes than it is for me to daven in the morning? We have 1,000,001 questions about why does it have to be this particular way? And it bothers us. It bothers us. It bothers us when people pass away younger than we would have expected. It bothers us when we try so hard to do something right and it flops. There's so many things bother us because we just don't know, we don't understand. And the truth is, we also understand nothing about God himself. So not only do we not understand his ways, his decisions, his choices, the truth is we don't understand anything about him. I mean, each of us has our little picture in our head that we've become comfortable with over a period of time. And like that's kind of our vision of God. The truth is we don't begin to understand. So Gan Eden is this series of aha moments. Tainug hahasaga. He shows you a little bit more of his presence. And a little bit more of his presence. You know, whenever we describe the idea that souls get elevated on a yahrzeit, right? Every year on a yahrzeit, a soul is ostensibly elevated to another level of Gan Eden. It's not an upgrade to your hotel suite. It's another level of divine presence that is shared with them. And it's another aha moment. It's not a moment. It's not an aha moment as you and I experience where in the moment it's exhilarating and then it's over. It's this whole, you know how it is sometimes. You learn something that you had never thought of before. And you spend days now applying this newfound knowledge to a whole array of things in your life. It's like, oh wow, now I understand that. And now I have insight into this. And it's this journey of discoveries because of one epiphany that you had. That's Gan Eden. Divine epiphanies. And because Hashem is infinite, you can never run out of them. Not only can you never run out of them, each time the epiphany is even more impressive. That's Gan Eden. It's wow upon wow of appreciation of God, with one severe limitation. It is impossible for any created entity, even if it is the highest, most developed, most advanced created entity, lehasig ki'im eizei ha'ara me'or Hashem. You will never succeed in grasping more than a glimmer of God's light. In other words, did you ever have a globe of the world growing up? Anybody ever have a globe of the world growing up? Right? The kids of the 21st century, I don't think they know what they are. So if you had one of those topographical globes where it actually felt bumpy, you remember those? They actually felt bumpy. So you have a sense of the world, right? You have a sense of what the earth is all about. So did you know that the varnish, the veneer that they put onto that globe is about the same thickness relative to the rest of the globe as the earth's crust is to the rest of the earth? In other words, you come here to South Africa, and you go down to the Witwatersrand, and you go down the deepest gold mine in the world, and guess what? You haven't begun to scratch the depth of the crust, which is just the veneer of the earth. Isn't that mind-blowing? Incredible concept, right? And that's earth that Hashem created. With all of our scientific knowledge and all of our exploration, we haven't yet scratched the surface of the earth that we stand on. And every time we learn something new, it's like, wow, that's amazing. Now we understand another whole dimension of how life works. Maybe one day the scientists will reach a point where they say, we know everything that there is to know about planet Earth. Elon Musk, it's time to go to Mars. But when you're dealing with God, Hashem is infinite. Every bit of epiphany, every bit of understanding immediately leaves you realizing how little you understand. Because every epiphany is a glance into how infinite Hashem is. So a person could spend millennia in Gan Eden, jumping up in spiritual levels on a daily basis. They could have the highest soul to start with, and after thousands of years, they wouldn't have got through the crust of infinite wisdom, insight, awareness, godliness. So there's an incredible frustration on the one hand, but much more importantly for us, there's a major limitation. Isn't that surprising? Because you would have thought our earth is where there are the most severe limitations, and out there in Gan Eden, those limitations fall away. It's actually not that simple. There in Gan Eden, you have severe limitations. Here on earth, the limitations fall away. That you didn't expect. That's why whatever is available in the entire structure of Gan Eden is all collectively still called Ziv, a glimmer. A glimmer means you're not even looking at the light yet. You're seeing the light come under the door. You don't even know what's behind that door. You're just seeing the light come under the door. You're just seeing the first pinkish hue on the horizon before dawn. That's the entire collective experience of Gan Eden. But God himself, leis machshava tvisa bei klau. No intellectual process, not even the intellectual process of a disembodied soul, not even the intellectual process of a soul that has climbed the rungs of Gan Eden for thousands of years, not even the intellectual process of the highest spiritual being that we don't even know how to name or describe, can ever grasp Hashem. So ironically, the spiritual realm has severe limitations. What we have to unpack and understand, and please God we'll do next week, is, so what's the edge if you're here in this world? How is it even remotely possible that this world could rival Gan Eden? I get it. Gan Eden has its limitations, but surely life on earth has greater limitations. Well, that's exactly the point. And that's, please God, what we'll learn next week.